As you might know, with Spider-Man 2 literally right around the corner, at least from when I'm making and releasing this video, I did some research just to make sure I was caught up on it, replayed the first game, replayed the second game, or, well, I don't know if we count it as a second game or just a whole other game within itself, but it's still technically the same game. I don't know how to explain Miles Morales. I'm going to say it's a sequel, although this one is labeled as a sequel. We'll get to it. But you might not know that in between each of the games there have been comic books that usually talk about some of the suits. For instance, the suit that turned Peter into a speedster. And there was a few other ones which I'm probably forgetting, but the point being is that they put comic books in between the games and they add a bit of story, not a lot, but enough to be like, where did that come from kind of story. And so there is a comic book that is between Miles Morales and Spider-Man 2, which has information in it. Now, I am a massive Spider-Man fan, so I'm obviously reading all the comics. Prove it. What? Prove it. Prove to me that you are a Spider-Man fan. You know, I am a Spider-Man fan. You ought to see the Spider-Man shrine. Yeah, no, that's a little bit creepy, but nonetheless, don't care. That's not enough proof. How else am I meant to prove that I am a fan other than the goddamn shrine? I want you to wear this for the rest of the video. Okay, fine. I'll go put it on. So I was going to do a thing where I just like sat in the chair and turned around, but me just even like walking onto the scene, I don't think you would want to see the full part of that. As I was saying, I am a massive Spider-Man fan, so I read a decent amount of comics, and as it turns out, there is a comic that was released on the 1st of May, which is kind of weird, because, you know, Aunt May, which actually adds to the story of the game universe. The comic was written by Christos Gage, and the art was done by Todd Newak and Ig Gara. Just wanted to give them credit. Let's get into what the story is about and what it means for the upcoming game. We start off in an office building that Jameson uses for his podcast, interviewing Mary Jane Watson about her new book, Perilous, A Journey into War-Torn Symkaria, which helps us figure out that this takes place a while after Miles Morales. Probably half a year at best is my guess, because there's no way someone wrote a book in that short amount of time. Jameson basically insults MJ, saying that her books aren't getting enough sales, and that his book, Saucy Soviets, The Spies Who Wish They Loved Me, sold way better. Which is something that I don't think I needed to know about Jameson. MJ goes on about how the book isn't for money, and it's more for just making a point about bringing, like, information towards the war that's happening. But they kind of go back and forth for a while, and Jameson's just kind of an arse about it. But then out of nowhere, Miles and Peter slam through the window with a new villain in tow. And I use quotes because Tarantula has shown up in a previous Spider-Man comic, which I think was based between the time of Spider-Man and Miles Morales. So it's kind of iffy. And also included multi-dimensional travel, so that kind of throws in a big major thing that kind of gets swept under the rug in Miles Morales, unless that scene was meant to be him talking about how he's going to go into another dimension and not go with Mary Jane into a war zone. And it's interesting too, because Peter even references fighting with another Spider-Man to get Tarantula, like, beaten. And you could take it as like, oh, well, maybe they retconned it and it's meant to be Miles and Peter who defeated Tarantula in this version. But that wouldn't really make much sense timeline-wise, because Miles hadn't, like, gotten into his role as a Spider-Man yet. But it's just a thing now, so I'm not going to go too in-depth about it. It doesn't seem like it would affect the new game. But long story short, they both beat the living crap out of Tarantula and leave the office building with him in tow, probably putting him in prison or something. But then we cut to MJ and Peter in the backyard of a house. Now, this house was Aunt May's and Uncle Ben's. They lived out in Queens, and so I'm assuming since Aunt May has passed away, all of her stuff has been given to Peter, and unfortunately apparently that includes a loan she took out during the Devil's Breath situation, so Peter has to pay that off as well. So he has a house out in Queens, he's paying off loans, and he's still working towards becoming a teacher by getting a degree, and that's pretty interesting. We might be able to see some Professor Parker or something in future. Maybe, I don't know if they would do that. And they get into a conversation about how Mary Jane wants to continue living in the city because it's easier for her that way for work and stuff like that. And Peter wants to live out in Queens. And Peter needs roommates, and he's like, oh, well, why doesn't Mary Jane move in? And they have a whole, like, that's the conflict of the comic between the two. Is just, he needs friends, she can't leave because work. And then Miles suddenly shows up and complains about studying. He has to choose between music or science. Dear God, I hope he picks science, because that little music mission in Miles Morales kind of proves that he isn't that great at music. He also mentions an upgrade to the lure that MJ uses throughout her missions, so now, hopefully, it should have the ability to stun people in a way, or at the very least take them out. I would hope it takes them out. That would make it so much easier, instead of having to do little sneaky sneaks across like two things and pushing a toolbox off at someone. It also helps so she doesn't have to run up and tase them in the back. And so, talking about the upgrades for the lures, they go, hey, we should get some parts to upgrade some other things. So they go out into the city looking for any kind of scrap tech shop or something. And conveniently, the three went past somewhere and Peter's spider sense went off. And so they're like, oh, well, we'll investigate. They go in, and just skipping through the general story is that we learn that there's some bad guys who use leftover tech from the Tinkerer, which I'm assuming is going to be an issue leading through the entirety of Spider-Man 2, is that people are using old tech from previous villains and stuff like that. So you might see people running around with Dr. Octopus tech, or again, Tinkerer technology. So that might be an issue. That might be something that they add. So you fight harder criminals who have gotten a hold of stuff they probably shouldn't have. And later on, we learn that there is a big bad to this group, and they think that he's some kind of magical king because he has some modified technology from Tinkerer, but he is just a guy who, oh, as far as we know, he's just a guy who has some modified technology. But this gives MJ a chance to use her new upgraded lure, which, interestingly, has the ability to produce an electronic charge and an incredibly loud sonar blast. And I would imagine that with Venom coming into the scene in the next game, that these lures are probably going to be used against Peter somehow, and it's going to probably be some creepy mission where you're playing as Mary Jane Watson and you're trying to run away from Peter, and you have to use these lures to make sure he doesn't find you. It'd be terrifying, but also really cool. And so they get into a fight with the big bad who showed up to help his friends, and they get him on the ground because of MJ's lure, and he still somehow escapes. We skip ahead a bit more, and we learn that the big guy was just trying to steal a magical artifact that could save his mother, which, wink wink, nudge nudge, I think that's meant to be a reference to the ending of Spider-Man, where Peter had to make the decision of either giving Aunt May the Devil's Breath serum and everyone else dying, or giving it to cure everyone else and letting Aunt May die.
You're gonna be okay, ma'am. I've got the cure right here.
Take off your mask. I want to see my nephew.
You knew?
And you know what she picked. But in this case, he only had to pick the option of resurrecting his mother. Well, not resurrecting. Stopping her from dying. She has cancer. And the guy's name is actually Parker Davis Robbins, which, it's another similarity with Parker. He tries to use the tablet to save his mother, and Peter stops Miles from interrupting it, so the guy gets a chance to try and save his mother. But it doesn't work, unfortunately. But the thing is that it wasn't just some, dud magical artifact. It did, produce lights. It did have an incantation and stuff. It would have done something. It was just a dud artifact. But that does imply that magic exists within the Insomniac universe. Now, you could argue this Sanctum Sectorium, I think I pronounced that right, technically already does that. It already proves that magic's a thing. And yeah, you could be right, but we never actually saw it with our eyes. And Mr. Negative was not a magical being. That was all about some weird sciencey mumbo jumbo that happened with Doc Otto and Norman and stuff. They weren't magically given to him. That's science ability. So I'm assuming that with the proof of magic in this comic book, that they're gonna apply that to Mysterio, and Mysterio will go away from using illusionary tech and just outright being magical. And also, I want to point out, this isn't at all related to how the information will work. Parker DR, that's what I'm going to call him instead of Davis Robbins, because that's a big name. Parker DR gave off heavy Red Hood vibes. I think that's what they were going for like a Marvel version of Red Hood, but you know, he wasn't there for long. Eventually they fought and stopped because his mother was like, hey, Parker, stop doing this. I'm gonna die anyway, just say your goodbyes. He's like, yeah, fine, okay. He said his goodbyes to his mother. Spider-Man were like, yeah, you can come out safely. They distracted the police for a little bit so he could say goodbye, and then he just went in. No issues. And so that was the big bad of the comic book dealt with. I don't think that we're going to see him as another big bad in the future, because he gave up willingly. But like, Tarantula, I mean, he got locked up, but he still seemed angry, so we might get something from Tarantula. And as we skip ahead in the comic book, we get to the happy wrap-up point where everyone's issues are starting to be solved. Miles has found an ESU course that will allow him to do both science and music, unfortunately. And MJ and Peter have come to accept that they will live separately, one in Queens, one in the city, at least for now. But now we get into the juicy part that I feel like will have the most effect from this comic book into Spider-Man 2. So we get a scene of Jameson, and he's talked about how he sold his podcast for a mint. I don't quite understand what that means, but he sold it, and so he's got money for it. And so he's offering to buy out the Daily Bugle. He's just that since it's paperback that it doesn't sell as well. And ironically, that is kind of true, because when you play Spider-Man, you can go up to the newspaper boxes and collect the newspapers, and there's like 56 to collect, but no one, I swear, like every single person I've met, I've mentioned it to, they're like, what? Like, they didn't think about it. They didn't think that you could do that. And so a lot of people did actually miss out on collecting the paperback versions of the news headlines and stuff. That kind of does imply that no one paid attention to the paperbacks. And so he wants to update it. He wants to upgrade it into a like tech empire kind of thing. Like, I don't know, whatever this is. And he actually gets the deal. So now Jameson will be the head of the Daily Bugle, probably again, and I would imagine that Mary Jane Watson would not be too happy knowing that her new boss is Jameson, who at the start of the comic she already had an argument with. So her keeping her job, I'm a little bit suspicious about, because he'll probably be like, oh, you're the one who I complained with the other day. Get the f*** out of my office. So here's what we can take in total of being something that could transition from the comic book into Spider-Man 2 as like solid like continuation. So Tarantula being a villain to fight maybe is just like a small side mission, or like just a little reference mission. That would be cool. It might not happen, because we already seen all these other characters like Kraven and Mysterio, and I think Prowler and Misery, who is probably a character that I'm not going to say the name of because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. But the mission would work similarly to like Screwball, Taskmaster, or Tombstone. And we'll probably get more music from Miles. Yay. As well as upgraded game mechanics for MJ missions, which could relate to Venom symbiotes as well, considering the sonar devices have been upped to the point of just making your ears bleed, and it has electric shocks now, which implies that Mary Jane's going to have to get around the Venom symbiote at some point. Maybe they make a reference to the Spider-Verse, although that could just be what the comic books were doing, and the video game might want to step away from that because it could get weird, and there's like a lot of like questions that they could probably answer by just going to another Peter Parker. You could find loose tech from Tinkerer laying around, and maybe Miles has to go around and destroy caches or something that have extra technology left behind by the Tinkerer and stuff. And it allows for the game creators to create a whole nother set of enemies that kind of like the Mafia that use the Silver Sable technology and magic, apparently. I'm assuming that if anyone's going to have magic, it'll be Mysterio, because that was just like, that's not technology, that is magic. Incantation, magic lights and everything. It didn't work, but it was implied to be magic pretty heavily. Unless Mysterio just sold him some kind of projection tablet that made pretty lights when you said something and it didn't actually do anything. That would make sense, but it would be kind of weak, and I would like to have magic in the game as a kind of thing that Peter has to fight against, or Miles. And of course the part that affects the story the most, Jameson buying out the Daily Bugle. So now Peter's going to be subjected to even more from Jameson, and Mary Jane might lose her job depending on how much of a grudge that Jameson holds against her. Yeah, it just seems like that's probably going to be the biggest thing that is going to carry over from this comic book into the game, is that Jameson has brought back the Bugle. But we know this is all just within a comic book. Just because it's in the comic book, it doesn't mean it's going to end up in the game. They might have a different explanation for it that's loosely based around it, but it's still interesting to see that there is a comic book between the two games that I'm assuming not a lot of people have read. And of course, if you want to properly read this comic book, you can get the digital version on Marvel Unlimited, and the physical version in a comic book store near you, I would assume. I know where my comic book store is, but I doubt that you have the same comic book store as me. And that's about it. This was more accurately an info dump to kind of fill you in on small details that might pop up in Spider-Man 2, but I don't know, because the game isn't out yet. I'm ready for the game to be out, but it's not. But I just got to be patient. It's only a few days away. Anyway, you can like and subscribe. If you don't mind, I'm going to get out of this thing, because as cool as it looks, it's actually really warm and uncomfortable.
Spider.